Cool, thank you everyone. So thanks for attending this session 3 of the Aotearoa Conversations program. This is titled Introduction to Impact, and our facilitator today will be Chris O'Neill. So I'll pass over to Chris now. Thank you, Chris.
Kia ora, Dan. Thank you very much. Kia ora, everyone. I'll do is I will dive us into a little bit of an outline. So we'll start by talking about objectives and a bit of whakawhanaungatanga as well. We're going to talk about what impact is and why it's important, why you might care about it. And we're going to talk through a framework called the Theory of Change framework, which is a really great way about thinking about how impact happens. And there's going to be plenty of room for discussion at the end. So as Tan said, I really encourage you to fire questions through on chat as we go through. Doing this in a webinar format or a Zoom format is obviously different to doing it face-to-face in the room. And so I really encourage you to use that chat function to create that sense of engagement through this process. But apart from the chat, there will be just an opportunity for open discussion at the end as well. Quick introduction about Ākina. We've been around for quite some time. Some of you know us quite well. Some of you, we might be a little bit new. So we are New Zealand's leading impact development organisation. We really focus on social and environmental outcomes, and we think about doing that through the heart of business. So most of the time that's through social enterprise, but we also think about what does that mean in the broader context. So we work right across the private sector, government and social enterprise to help increase impact. So we do that through a couple of different avenues. We do capability building. So we work with organizations to build their capability to understand impact and to develop their business models, their impact models, and think about how they can create more impact. We have Jackson Rowland, who leads our impact investment work. So you'll have maybe seen that he's got some sessions through this and through the World Forum as well. So that's really thinking about how can we bring more capital towards creating impact. We've got an impact consulting team, which is the team that I'm part of. We work with organizations to help understand, measure and maximize the impact that they're having. And we do that both domestically and internationally. And we also have social procurement, Sean Barnes, who leads our social procurement. So that's helping organizations, social enterprises, work with larger businesses to bring social enterprises into their supply chain. So today, we've got a couple of objectives for this session. The first is to familiarize you with the language and methodology associated with impact. This area is at risk of being a bit jargony, a bit framework heavy. So we're going to try and get rid of some of those myths, but it's not complicated. It's not really dependent on using secret handshakes or complicated methods. Actually, a lot of it is common sense that will really resonate with you, I think. And the second is to think about how you can understand, measure, manage, and communicate your impact. So using tools like Theory of Change to undertake that work. And then finally, to answer any specific questions you have. So that through the session as we go, and also in that end session. So I encourage you to think about what specific questions you might have, what you might want to uncover, and I'm happy to answer those questions, but also use the insight that we've got across our guests, the people attending here today. I think we've got some really smart, experienced people on the call, some of whom I know, some of whom I don't. So really keen to learn and share knowledge across the group. So firstly, a little bit of whakawhanaungatanga. So you've met Tan. Ellen is also on the call, I think, has been. Ellen's leading a lot of this work around the Aotearoa Conversations, but also her role as chair of the Social Enterprise World Forum. So Ellen, thank you for joining us for part of this session. A little bit about me. Ko Sugarloaf te moanga, ko te whonga nui atara te moana, ko O'Neill te iwi no Ireland o, ko Glendalough te turanga waiwai, ko Chris toku ingoa, ko te Ākina Foundation taku mahi. So I'm Chris. I was born in England, but to Irish parents, but I've lived in New Zealand most of my life. Now happily call Wellington my home. Very proud, happy Wellingtonian, quite wedded to the place. Big fan of it. So if you want to share who you are, feel free to pop that in the chat box. I've got the chat box up on my screen as well, so I'll be able to see that. So yeah, just encourage you to share maybe just a little something about yourself. And maybe if you want to pop in that box as well, one thing that you're hoping to get out of this session, that'll really help me guide how we go through this, and so that you get the most out of it as well. So first up, we're going to talk about what is impact. For us, impact is the positive social or environmental changes or outcomes that happen because of an activity. So the shift we're trying to help people understand is the shift from thinking about activities to thinking about outcomes. So for a long time, a lot of organizations have reported on what they've done. You know, how many people came to our workshop, or how many boxes of food did we deliver? But that's really only part of the story. The part of the story we think is far more interesting is what is the change that happened because of that. You know, how many people were able to secure employment who couldn't previously secure employment, or how many people felt safe or connected to their community. So really simple example here that we've got up on screen. You might think, you might talk about your activity being running a composting workshop, but actually your ultimate goal is thinking about how you might reduce carbon emissions and what that means for the environment. The other reason we spend a lot of time thinking about impact is we think that there's a huge opportunity. So obviously there's the huge impact opportunity, but there's a lot driving that opportunity. There's a lot of demand. So we're seeing that in New Zealand, social procurement is becoming really important to this conversation. And Sean, I'm sure would, could spend an entire hour talking about this, but we're going to give you the very high level version. And the key thing is that government especially are investing a lot of energy in this. They're really expecting organizations to be delivering impact, and that's just going to filter down. So it doesn't matter whether you're a big business or you're deep within the supply chain of a business. For those of you who are thinking about selling to business or who do sell to business, being able to tell your impact story to them is really important, and it's going to become more and more important because more and more contracts are going to start asking, what is that positive social or environmental cultural impact that people are having. So government's spending a lot in this space, and employees and consumers are really demanding it as well. People are expecting, that organizations are doing good. More and more evidence is showing that employee engagement is really important, and that's something we hear a lot when we do consulting work with companies, that they really want to be able to tell a meaningful story of the impact they're having. So as social enterprises, it's really important to be able to think about how your own team, have connected with you because you're doing something really incredible in the world, and being able to tell that story to each other is really important because that helps give you that energy and drive to keep going. But for those of you who might be selling to customers, to the general public, they really want to hear that story too. So having a way to tell that story is really important. So that's what we're going to explore today is how do you frame up that story, and how can you tell it in a really credible, meaningful way that's not some of the trends that we are worried about seeing, of greenwashing or social washing, where people are not able to back up the claims that they're making. And finally, for those of you who are thinking you might scale your social enterprise down the track, that you might want to get investment, investors, shareholders are thinking about this more and more. And that's both domestically and internationally. We're seeing that trend. So we started with organizations and investors thinking about things like environmental, social, and governance elements, which are often referred to as ESG factors. But now more and more we're seeing people move past that. They're moving past those really simple to measure things, and actually they're getting into the nitty gritty. We've worked with organizations here in New Zealand who have overseas shareholders, companies that have scaled and grown and had large, hundreds of millions or billions of dollars invested from overseas. And the questionnaires that those owners, those new owners are asking, they're asking really in-depth questions about diversity, equality, environmental outcomes. So this really is a really strong trend that we're seeing across lots of different areas. But of course, the thing that matters most, he tangata. So, we have a responsibility of people, don't we? We have a responsibility to do the right thing and to understand that we're doing the right thing. So that's the other aspect here, is that it's not just about telling a story of what you think is happening, but actually diving into how things happen and making sure that you can actually credibly show a logical link. And we'll dive into that when we talk about theory of change work. So what I want to take you through first is a bit of a journey. So we're going to go through each of these steps in detail, but basically we think that there's a relatively good journey that you can go on when you're thinking about impact. So first you're going to think about identifying the impact. You're going to think about who's relevant, who's important to you. You're going to think about evidence and theory and how change happens. And then how can you measure that change? How can you prove that that's change has happened? And then learning from that. There's no point gathering data for data's sake. Actually, we really want to be able to show that we're making meaningful change and learn where we haven't, understand why sometimes things don't work and how we might make them work better in the future, how we might have more impact in the future. So we think the first part of the journey is thinking about what your impact goals are. So it sounds simple, but it's really important to understand what you're working towards. So often people start with vision statements, mission statements, but we think that actually, talking specifically about what is the change that you're having to make. So there's a bit of a risk here that it can be a bit generic. So you do have to be careful. I often talk about how lots of impact goals, if you go too far, you just end up with sort of happy, healthy, economically well New Zealanders, for example. And that's a great goal, but it's not really specific to what you're trying to achieve. So a better example might be talking about how you help more rangatahi graduate from school, or more whānau are financially resilient, for example. So we're being specific about who we're talking about and what that change is for them, but we're talking about a bit of a longer term change. And the good thing about impact goals is that they're only part of what you're going to talk about. So don't get too caught up at this stage about how measurable those goals might be, because actually sometimes those goals that you're achieving are so far out and are actually affected by lots of systemic factors. So it doesn't necessarily have to be something that you can categorically prove was created by you, but we'll talk about that journey of how you demonstrate your contribution towards that happening. Next, you're going to think about the activities. So you might already be undertaking activities in your social enterprise. You might be working towards reduced carbon emissions, for example, and you'll be having some activities that you'll be undertaking. You might be working to reduce single plastic bag use. All this, obviously not suitable now that we ban them, but not using straws, those sorts of things. You might be undertaking either educational campaigns. You might be trying to create behavioural change. Or you might be part of the solution. You might be part of actually saying, look, here we've got some really great bamboo straws that people can be using instead. So those are kind of the bookends of your process, what we call the theory of change. You've got your impact, which is where you're heading towards, and you've got your activity, the thing that you're doing to get there. And there are lots of different activities you might be choosing to undertake. So if you haven't started an activity, you're more focused on the impact that you're trying to have, now's a really great time to think about what's the right activity for us to be undertaking. Because there are lots of different ways to achieve any given goal. There are lots and lots of different ways that you can reduce carbon emissions. And so you want to think, well, there are a couple of ways we might identify how to achieve that goal. So it's really great to be talking to stakeholders for two reasons. If you haven't started undertaking an activity, then getting out and talking to people, who work in that space. And stakeholders is kind of the catch-all term, because there isn't really a great term to talk about all the different people you might talk to. So you might want to talk to people who would be your customers. You might want to talk to people who will benefit from the change that you're thinking about making. You might want to talk to organizations who want to invest in the change that you're trying to make. They might be funding organizations, or they might be the government, for example. And by understanding all of these different perspectives, you can do two things. You can understand what the best activity might be, or if you're already undertaking an activity, you can understand from them what they see as the change process. What is it that's leading to change? So we think that actually getting out and talking to people is really important. Often we work with organizations and they say, great, I'll do a survey. And the thing that I would caution there is that surveys are great if you want to get, a thin amount of information from a lot of people, but actually there's really nothing that matches sitting down with people and having a conversation and being able to follow the threads of thinking. Sometimes people do that in groups. They sit down and talk to different stakeholders they might have, or they do it in one-on-one interviews. And that's really going to depend on your context and the sort of relationships you have with people. But when you're thinking about change, bear in mind those two things. If you haven't started, get out and talk to people and understand what it is that they think will make a difference. Understand, if you're working with a community, what is it that the community wants you to do? And on the other side, if you're already undertaking an activity, go out and talk to people and ask them what the change that they see as happening. Because sometimes it can be quite hard sitting outside the process or sitting from the position you're in to really understand that change and how it happens. Because often you might only see the end result and not see the bits that happen in the middle or the bits that happen outside your view. The other thing we think that's really important is thinking about evidence. For some sectors, there are some really great guides. For some programs, there's really great evidence. So in education, for example, there's often really great research on what leads to increased literacy or what leads to increased engagement for children in schools, those sorts of things. There's an organization in the UK called New Philanthropy Capital, and they've done a whole range of what they call outcomes maps. So what those do is they track what the outcomes are in different sectors. So for example, there's one on arts and culture. And they look at what are the things that contribute towards change. In the UK, there's a bunch of organizations called the What Works Network. And similarly, they take different sectors. So education, literacy is one sector that they work in. And what they've done is they've gathered evidence to see what actually makes a difference in these areas. So often there'll be really great evidence out there to show what is effective. So if you haven't yet started a program, then thinking about looking at that evidence and looking at other programs. Often there might be programs in other countries that you can look at. And then the important thing to think is, what does that mean in our context? What does that mean in Aotearoa, New Zealand? What does that mean in a treaty partnership context? How do we integrate Te Ao Māori and tikanga into those approaches as well? So I'm not suggesting that you can take these things off the shelf. You've definitely got to think about the change of context, but there might be some things out there that you can draw on. And if you already have an ongoing activity, then you can actually also look at this evidence and you can see, well, we know that we're doing programs to help with literacy, for example. And we know that children who have great maths and reading literacy are more likely to be successful at school. So that you can look at the evidence and say, okay, we can actually show to our customers, our funders, to our staff, whoever it is that you want to tell the story to, we can say, look, we don't need to measure whether or not the children do better at school, because that's really hard, and there's a whole load of contextual factors that are going to affect that across different demographics, different schools, different timelines, different global pandemics that are going to interfere with our ability to measure this. But we can say pretty conclusively that if we can lift the literacy or the numeracy of these students, they will do better in school. And that's the sort of logical link that we're going to explore in a few minutes. But it's really important because it means that you don't necessarily have to measure everything, and you don't necessarily have to prove everything yourself. You can actually start to rely on some of this outside evidence. So Alex has just asked, can we pop links for good resources? Absolutely. So we'll be able to share this presentation. I'm not quite sure the process of that, but I'll have a chat to Aotearoa Conversations about that, and we'll add in a slide with some of those links. So thanks Alex for asking that. So I want to talk about one tool that you can use to tell your story of impact. The one we love is theory of change. There's lots of different names for this kind of stuff. Sometimes you might hear things like logic models or intervention logic, and they're all sort of the same, sort of different. It's not worth getting too caught up in the differences, but essentially they all assume that something happens and then something happens because of that thing, and then over time change happens. Some are more structured than others. The theory of change we like, because the way we use it, certainly and the way we share it, is that it's quite a flexible model. Some of the other models are very sort of boxy and linear, whereas with theory of change, you can go a little bit crazy in terms of demonstrating, cycles and things like that that might be more relevant to your context. So what we've got up on screen is the skeleton, I guess you could say, of a theory of change. It starts on the left-hand side with the activities that you do. So thinking about what is the situation or the issue or the opportunity, depending on how you want to phrase it and the context that you work in. What is the activity that you do? And who are the people or the planet that has an interest in that? So that might be the people who benefit from the work you do. It might be the people who you need to engage in order for this to be successful. And then we've got outputs. So outputs are really sort of the direct follow-on from the thing that you do. So that we'll explore that in a minute. And then we move into the change that happens, these yellow boxes. So we have short-term changes, outcomes, medium-term outcomes, and long-term outcomes. Now that time horizon is going to be different for different people. For some people, long-term outcomes might be intergenerational. We might be talking a really long timeline. For others, it might be a period of 5 years where a child's at school. But what's happening is we're looking at the links across, and then finally we're ending up with this impact. Let's say more children graduate, for example, from school, or more children enter employment of their choice, something like that. So underpinning each of the boxes with the little arrows underneath is a logical link. So we've got logical links that take us from outputs to outcomes, and then from one outcome to another. So when we have a theory of change, we always have arrows leading between different outcomes. So an outcome is the change that happens, and we'll go through some examples to help you understand what that means. But between each one of those, we have a logical link. So the analogy we like to use is basketball. And I'm not a super expert on basketball, but I know enough about this part of it. So throwing a basketball into a basketball hoop is a relatively simple, but not easy, process. It's quite predictable. You can mathematically map how it works. And the reason for that is that you throw the ball through a parabolic curve. And if you throw the ball on a parabolic curve, standing in the right place, your basketball will get in the basket hoop. Now, it's not going to work out every time, but there is a logical process that underpins all of that. So we're getting from the activity, the throwing of the ball, through to the goal. So what we're looking for here is, do we have that logical link? Do we have a semi-repeatable logic or process that explains why we get to the place we get to when it comes to change? So that's the link we see between different parts of the theory of change. So here's a relatively linear theory of change. We'll explore a few in a moment that are less linear. But basically, we can look here and say, okay, well, the issue we've got is that we've got large quantities of food waste going into landfill, and that's releasing methane gas. So that's the thing that we don't want to happen. We've done our research, and we think that there's appetite in our community for a composting workshop. We've done a bit of scientific, academic research, and we can see that there's a really great link in the environmental space between awareness of solutions and people implementing those solutions. So we know that if we run the composting workshop, we think we're going to see change. So who are our key stakeholders? Maybe the local landfill might be able to help us identify people who are creating a lot of food waste, or we might also think that local families are a key lever for this. So our output, or the thing that we're able to measure happening straight away is the number of people coming to our workshops. So we might run those workshops and we'd be able to say, great, okay, 15 families came along. So the thing we're going to count here. So that's what an output is, often an easily countable thing. That's the activity that you're undertaking. So when we look at our short-term outcomes, we're going to see that people have got increased awareness and they've learned some skills and gained some knowledge. So that's because they went to the workshop. So we're still not seeing any actual change. We're just seeing that these people are now sort of better equipped to undertake change. If we have those two things, then we're going to see some other medium-term outcomes. So families are going to become more motivated. They might encourage people, internally or externally to their family. They've got the resources to compost at home. So maybe they got a bin, or some educational material when they went along, and they're connecting with other families. Now, what we can explore here is there might be some outcomes that are really important to our long-term change, or they might be less important. So in this case, we think that it's important that families connect with each other because they're going to stay connected to the waste community. But it could also be that ultimately we discover that families don't become connected to the waste community. So it's nice that families connect with each other, but it starts to look like a secondary outcome, one that we're not so interested in optimizing, but could be important if we need to tell that story to certain funders. So a funder might be interested in community connection, for example. So we might dial up telling that part of the story because that would enable us to achieve our other goals. So our long-term outcomes are actually where we start to see the change in this model. So we see families are actually starting to embed composting into their family routine, and more families are doing composting at home. So you can see there's an interrelationship between each of these, and there's a logical flow as we get through to the end, which is less food waste goes to landfill. So we're going to talk about measurement as part of this session as well, but looking at this model, it's important to note where we might choose to measure. So for example, measuring how much food waste goes to landfill is a pretty tricky thing to measure. It would involve potentially thinking about, analyzing the actual waste going into through the landfill gates, and that's not an easy thing to undertake. But we can go backwards through the model, and we could say, okay, well, could we, for example, measure how much families are composting? So we might send them a survey which says, can you let us know how many tubs of a standard size you're putting into the compost bin every week? And then we can extrapolate out from that. So what we're looking for there is almost a proxy of the final result. We're able to say, look, we know that on average, the families are making, this much, they're diverting this much food waste. And that can help us tell that story for scaling and growth as well. So, we could run a pilot and use this theory of change model to say, look, we ran this with 100 families and we diverted, 100 kilograms or one dumpster truck or, whatever measure you want to use. But if we can scale this up to 1,000 families, this is the impact that we could have. So we're pairing the logic with some measurement as well to help tell that story. So each of those blue lines, blue arrows within here is showing that logical link. So for example, if families learn skills and knowledge, then we think that they've got the resources to undertake composting. If we think that they have the resources to undertake composting, they're more likely to actually do the composting. And if they're doing the composting, then less food waste will be going to landfill. So it's that logical link. So again, the further you get to the impact side of that model, the harder it is to actually measure for yourself, but it's the logic that carries you through on that. So Alex has just asked a question, what sort of statistical methods would be used to demonstrate long-term impacts for families using less food? So that's a great question, Alex. I'm not a statistician, so I'm not going to be able to answer the statistical methods side of it. But what I would encourage you to do there is think about how could you measure the short-term change and extrapolate that out to a long-term change. So for example, if we're thinking here about using less food, I'm not sure whether you meant less food waste there, possibly. You would definitely need to do some rigorous statistical work to measure it out. But what we tend to encourage is a relatively pragmatic approach. And we find that most funders respond to relatively pragmatic approaches. So even as simple as being, saying, look, we worked with 100 families. If you fund us, we could work with 1,000. We think we can have 10 times the impact if we reached 10 times the number of people. Thanks for that question, Alex. And so we're going to run through a couple of examples of theories of change. I'm not going to talk through the details of each of these, but I just want to flash them up and go through them briefly to show that they're not always a simple linear process. So here we've got the dark green boxes. Those are some of the outcomes, the longer term outcomes that we're looking at, and the white boxes, which are the activity and the logical process. So you can see here that really the key thread here goes through the middle. So we've got a bit of a spine that goes through the middle, and we're working towards that goal of less need for harmful mining. In this case, Mint Innovation is an organization that takes e-waste and extracts the precious metals like gold out of it using a biological, eco-friendly process that doesn't create dangerous byproducts that need to be disposed of. So relatively simple here, and I think that's the key, is that simplicity is often the best way to convey meaning. If models are too complex, it's much harder to interpret them, but we will show you one slightly more complicated model as part of this. And actually that simplification process can be one of the hardest parts of the process. We like to talk about how there's a really messy stage in the middle. So, when you first start working on your theory of change, you'll put all of your outcomes down and work through, you gather them all. And then actually getting from, 60 pieces of paper on your wall down to 9 or 10 boxes is a tricky process. And what you've got to watch out for is really making sure that you're not losing the logic, you're not losing the nuance within that as you sort of go down through that process. Here's one for an organization called Oaktree Demanding. So this is an organization based in Christchurch. So what they do is they employ people who've come out of prison or people who are struggling to find employment. And demanding is the technical name for taking stuff out of a container. So basically they unpack containers for big companies like foodstuffs and shift it from the container into a warehouse or from a container into a transport vehicle or something like that. And so when we look at this model, we're seeing that there are 4 key threads to what they're doing. They're developing new skills. They're developing a better understanding of themselves. They're setting individuals up for success, and they're improving the mental and physical health of their employees. And ultimately, that's going to lead to long-term employment, better community outcomes, and better health outcomes. So you can see here what we're trying to do is we're trying to sum up some really clear impact areas, and also think about how those impact areas might relate to different stakeholders. So, for example, Ministry for Social Development, MSD, would be particularly interested in the long-term employment outcomes in this space. Other organizations might, like Ministry for Health, might be interested in the better health outcomes that they're achieving. So by being able to tell different stories to different stakeholders, different funders, different partners, you're able to better enable them to be part of your journey. And that might not be about funding, that might be about access to support or alignment. One of the things that we think is really important is when partners can communicate impact to each other, it becomes much easier to align programs, and becomes much easier to align outcomes and identify opportunities to work together on projects. So here's a more complicated theory of change. This is for Tuputoa. Tuputoa work with companies and young Māori and Pacific people to get more high-skilled people, high-skilled Māori and Pacific people into employment and into meaningful employment, and especially leadership pathways. So you can see here what what's developed here is kind of what we look at as a waves of change model. So the first wave is undertaking an internship with Tuputoa. The second phase is the Tuputoa leadership development work, where we're in the job. And then that final stage is actual leadership. So how is it that Māori Pacific people are transitioning into those key leadership positions. And this model talks about what are the benefits to the individuals, but what are the benefits to the business as well, because the businesses that Tupu Toa partner with are obviously a key part of the journey and a key part of the change as well. I'm going to talk briefly about indicators. Indicators is a massive area that we could spend ages going over, but essentially indicators are how you measure the change. If we jump back to one of our theories of change, we can see that there are different areas here that we could be measuring. We could measure people's self-esteem, for example. We could measure whether people feel like they've become financially self-sufficient. We could measure, are people getting a meaningful wage, living wage, for example. So indicators are the way that we measure the outcomes that we've identified within our theory of change model. So that's why having a really good theory of change model is important, because it's the foundation for that measurement. And of course, there's not much point measuring for measurement's sake. What you do with that data is really important. So we think that once you've identified your indicators, identified these measures, then you're going to want to analyze and learn from them. And so it's really important that the indicators themselves are going to be useful in that way. So thinking about what you might measure and how you might measure it is really important. So some things are really, really hard to measure. Some things require, some mental health changes, for example, have quite complicated academic measures that you need to meet in order to be quite rigorous. But then some other areas are much easier to measure. So thinking about what's feasible in your context, what are you already measuring that you could make use of? What could your partners potentially be measuring? And what's realistic? So for example, getting the individual academic records of students is going to be a really hard thing to get. So thinking laterally, how might you access that kind of information, or how could you access a proxy for that information? So for example, if you can't get the exact data, who could you ask who might have a perspective on that data? So could you ask teachers, for example, what changes did you observe in the students after the intervention that we made? Did you see improved classroom attention, for example, or did you see improved reading performance? So we can't always measure the thing. Sometimes we have to measure something that stands in as a proxy for the thing. And also timelines are really important, obviously, with measurement too. It's very hard to measure, 5 or 10 years down the track of an intervention that you might have been responsible for. And also it becomes much harder to claim that out, the outcomes, when there are so many other factors that might be affecting it as well. So think about, you can use the model of SMART goals, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound as a model. It's not quite perfect in terms of sort of tracking across to the way indicators work, but it will give you some good insight into how you might design good indicators. So the last point I want to think about is you've done all this work. You've developed a theory of change. You've thought about how your outcomes happen. You've thought about all of those logical links. You've started to measure them, and you're ready to tell that story. There are 7 things that we think this process is useful for. So it's really useful for planning the impact you want to have. Whether you haven't yet started, you're starting something new, or you're already implementing. You really need a clear plan of where you're trying to get to in terms of your impact. It helps deliver, so it helps you understand what activities that you think you want to undertake and how you might undertake them. It helps you partner. So sometimes with a theory of change, you'll recognize that actually there's a really key input here, like you need certain technologies or you need certain support. There might be that there are complementary programs that other organizations offer, and that if you bring those complementary programs in, you can actually magnify your impact. And if you're able to tell the story of your impact, it's much easier to talk to your partner about the value of working together, or potential partner. Obviously, if you've got indicators, you can measure the impact that you're having, and from that measurement, you can prove the impact. So that's especially important when you're working with funders, especially important for demonstrating it to customers and potentially investors as well, if you're looking for impact investment. And also you're going to want to think about how you improve your impact. So actually paying attention to how your impact happens will help you understand where you might be able to change things. You might notice that you thought that an outcome would happen, but then in practice, when you measure it, that outcome isn't happening. So you can dive further and understand, well, we think that that's important. We want that outcome to happen. How can we dive in and explore that more? And finally, communicate. You're going to want to celebrate the success that you're having. And coming back to the concepts of customers, partners, shareholders, your team, being able to tell the story of your impact is a tool for helping magnify your impact. So it will really help you grow and develop. So I wanted to make space for some discussion. If you have questions or thoughts, Tan, you can see more than I can in terms of video. So if anybody wants to put a text question in or a text perspective, please. Otherwise, Tan can facilitate some video questions or video chat as well.
Thanks very much, Chris. Have you finished with your slides, Chris, so we can...
Yep, I can take them off.
Great.
Yep.
Does anyone have an enterprise that they're working with right now that just using the frameworks that Chris has presented that you'd like to actually work through? Great. Thanks.
Hey, Chris, thank you so much. So we're working here at Kaipara Kai Hub with farmers, growers and food producers, looking at diversified land use for climate resilience and value added to the community and to the economy here in Kaipara. One thing that we're struggling with is we're collecting a lot of data just using spreadsheets at the moment. And some of that data is around engagement with the community and how many people we're engaging with and how frequent after our initial engagements. But we're seeing people who are starting to actually experiment with some of the land use, and we're looking at whether we look at GIS-based tools or whether we use something like Asana, like I know other people in the impact space use that for some of their reporting. I wondered if you or anyone else on the call actually could name some interesting tools that you're using so that we can, I know spreadsheets are amazing, but I'm wondering if there's something else out there that could be helping us.
Yeah, great. I'll field it first and then open the space for others to comment. We've just done quite a bit of work internally on this exact question, and you're right. It's often the solutions are not always obvious, but also the problem is that the solutions are sometimes not very well described as well. So some of the different things we've looked at, we looked at impact management specific platforms. So we're currently working with an international partner called SOPACT, S-O-P-A-C-T, that does impact management software, and we're evaluating the suitability of that as a platform. We looked at some platforms that are designed for data analytics. So often they're described as business intelligence platforms. The disadvantage with those sorts of platforms is that they tend to be quite bespoke. You tend to have to build them out to do what you want. So, for example, Salesforce offer a free not-for-profit version, and it's super powerful, but it's almost a full-time job to kind of put it together and wrangle it and keep it going. There are some more off-the-shelf options. So one that we looked at was a platform called Good Data. And I think they've just recently expanded their offering to New Zealand. Again, they're within that business intelligence platform approach. Another organization who worked in the GIS space, who we did some work with, based in Samoa. I'm trying to remember, Bruce, you didn't happen to do any of that work, did you? Let me come back to you on that. I can't quite remember their name. but they've done a whole lot of work around agriculture and GIS as well in the Pacific. But yeah, often the challenges that are, the final sort of bucket of offerings in that space are case management systems. So probably less relevant for you, Lana, but possibly for others. There's one called Impactosaurus, which is a brilliantly named piece of software that's more sort of designed for use with individuals and their change journey that they go on. So I think, yeah, I mean, often it's about sort of cobbling together stuff that works in your situation. So I don't have a definitive answer for you in that situation, but maybe some areas to explore. Anybody else?
That's a great question. It's always good to actually apply what you're working on. Lana, anyone else there? Bruce, Coco, I know you've been in the earlier sessions. Is there something that you wanted to ask there in terms of what you're working on?
Well, I'll put my hand up. Chris, thank you very much. It's hard to squeeze so much complexity into a short presentation. So that was really good. I wondered about whether you also recognize or recommend that social entrepreneurs actually recognize negative impacts. We all go into this space full of optimism and all the good intentions in the world. And I think sometimes that blinds us to the negative impacts. And if we only define impact in terms of positive social change, I think sometimes that blinds us to the fact that our best intentioned efforts sometimes can create dependency or, you know, other negative things. So I wonder if it's a useful exercise in your experience to, when you're building that impact model, to actually pause for a second and say, but how could this go terribly wrong, even though we don't mean it to?
Yeah, you've hit on one of my favorite topics, Bruce. Thank you. I absolutely. I think we need to be very conscious of the negative outcomes that might be happening. And I think that's an important part of the measurement side of it is, you know, not being afraid to ask that question potentially as well. The other thing that I think is super important that often gets swept under the rug is what would have happened anyway, or what the economists like to call the counterfactual. You know, I see this a lot where we, you know, where organizations say, you know, look at the great work we did. And you know, if you look at models like scholarship models, for example, you know, if you provide a scholarship to an individual, are you just facilitating the success of somebody who would have got there anyway? Because if you're giving out scholarships, you only give them out to the best 5% often, right? So those 5% probably would have gone on to do whatever they were going to do with or without your scholarship. But the scholarship organization will claim their success forever after. You know, in Wellington right now, there's a billboard up for Marsden School, I think it is, and it's got a photo of a Google engineer. And, you know, Marsden ignited my curiosity in science and technology, and now I'm an engineer at Google. And I just don't buy that kind of comment. You know, it's like that person probably would have been successful no matter, you know, what school they went to because of a whole load of other contextual reasons, potentially including the fact that their parents could afford to send them to a private school, not least. I think, exploring, you know, what goes wrong. And, you know, we've talked, I think, previously about great examples like that. Like, if anybody's interested in this, look up Play Pumps. So Play Pumps was an international development project, not a social enterprise, but an international development project that went catastrophically wrong because people didn't understand the context in which they were working in well enough, and didn't understand how long-term change happens and how you enable long-term change. And then similarly, you know, what would have happened if we'd done nothing? You know, have we actually been responsible for this change, or did we just kind of walk alongside, you know, a change that was going to happen anyway? Great question, Bruce. Thank you.
It's a really, really good question. There's never a really perfect answer to things, is there, Bruce? It's essentially your point. Yeah. Anyone else there in terms of either the stuff that you're working on or the organisations?
Yeah, thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, it is fantastic, fantastic book. And yeah, for people interested in that space, my brain, the name of the philosophy, the guy who wrote that book, he launched a company and they would, it'll come back to me, that approach.
The approach was, I think it's called effective altruism.
Thank you. Yes, effective altruism.
And he's got this website called something like Job Board or something like, yeah, that guy.
Yeah, some really, so for those who haven't read the book, some really fascinating explorations in there around how do you achieve impact. A brilliant scenario where he talks through a hypothetical situation of, if you're studying to become a doctor in the UK, what should you do? Should you go to Africa and, provide help to people who wouldn't otherwise receive medical support? Should you just go through the NHS system in the UK and help people there? Or should you donate your salary? Should you go and get the best salary you can, let's say in America, and donate the surplus of that salary, and they explore all the different positive and negative outcomes of each of those different scenarios. It's quite an interesting mental exercise. Thanks, Bruce.
Chalmers.org as well. Oh, thanks, Bruce. Hi, Chris. We've got about 2 or 3 more minutes. And if someone has a question, it would be good just for you to outline the practical next steps. What do people do if they want to start measuring some of this? What are the tools available? What would be your recommendations here? Because you can get quickly bogged down by the amount of stuff that's out there.
Yeah, I think the easiest thing people can do is just start paying attention to the people you talk to and start capturing the stories they tell you. And that doesn't need to be difficult. Keep them in a Word document, write them down, and over time you'll start to see trends coming through. And then you can start to put headings in there, and that will start to develop some of those outcomes for you. That's the simplest thing you can do. And the next step up is you could run a theory of change workshop with your own team. Again, it's not complicated. Basically, you get a big white wall, you get a whole load of post-it notes, and you just start writing down everything that changes because of the work that you do. You stick them up on the wall, and then you just start to cluster them, and you start to put them in a bit of a logical order. And eventually, through 2 or 3 cycles of refinement, you'll end up with something like what I showed you in terms of the theory of change. And then just choose a couple of things to get started measuring. Don't try and measure everything all at once. Just grab 2 or 3 things that you think, yeah, we could easily measure that, or we're already measuring that. Let's put a bit of time into keeping track of those things, and then use that data. Again, the worst, you don't want to be collecting a whole load of data for no reason.
Can I ask one more question?
Yes, of course.
Chris? So I'm kind of new to public sector, and one thing in my community that is a bad word is the word change. And people talk about, you should talk about opportunities and new possibilities rather than saying change in the first interaction that you have with people. What are your thoughts on navigating this?
Yeah, it's so tricky, isn't it? So I think what you're referring to underneath that is a concept called strengths-based approaches. I think what's tricky is the language is constantly evolving, right? So, what works in one context doesn't work in another. So, I spend a lot of my time talking to government and companies, and not as much of my time deep in the community. But I'm very conscious that I have to change the framing. I have to change the language between those worlds, even between government, of corporate as well. So yeah, I think you're right that framing and language is incredibly important for people. I think there's we're seeing a lot of recurring themes like change fatigue, consultation fatigue, people, but conversely, nothing about us without us, right? So you have to engage meaningfully with communities. And I think some of that consultation fatigue is actually, consultation fatigue is not the same as engagement fatigue. People are sick of people turning up, asking their opinion, and then going away and doing what they were going to do anyway. I think people are still hungry for meaningful conversation and meaningful engagement. And yeah, absolutely, for some people, it's not about change, it's not about problems, it's not about obstacles, it's about opportunities, it's about how do we work together, and how do we take a partnership approach to these things. So yeah, great, thanks for raising that, Lana. Language is really, really important in how you engage with people.
Thanks very much, Chris. What we'll do now is if we end the session with Chris. Thanks very much, Chris.